Okay. Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to P&P Live. Thank you so much for joining us in this brand new format where we can continue to bring authors and their new books to the Politics and Prose community. As this is our inaugural online event, first one ever, we're just asking that you bear with us as we work out any kinks and kind of get comfortable with this new platform, but I think it's going to go great. A few items before we begin. So at any time during tonight's event, you can click on the green button below to purchase the book, and it goes straight to P&P's website, and it'll open in a new window so you won't lose your event. So make sure you click on that, and just know that now through at least March 31st, Politics and Prose is offering free media mail shipping on all orders. So make sure you buy tonight's book and stock up for when you're stuck at home. Make sure you get all the books that you need. Also, just like all of our in-person events, you will still be able to ask the author a question by clicking on the Ask a Question box, and you can see that kind of near the bottom of your screen. You can submit your question and then read other people's questions, and also upvote the question that you want to hear the author answer by clicking these little arrows that are on the side. So you'll see those to upvote a question, and it's kind of like liking it on Facebook. Also a reminder that unlike our in-person events, the author, host, and audience members cannot see you through the screen. So please feel empowered to stay in your pajamas without judgment. We will never know. One thing that the author wanted me to mention tonight is that if you would like to ask him to join your book club or any other kind of meeting, church, synagogue, political event, he is more than happy to do so in these times. Everything is going digital, and so in some ways it makes it a little easier. So if you do have an ask for him for that, you can either visit his website, which is michaelsigner.com, or you can email him at msigner.author@gmail.com. And I can say that again at the end in case you didn't catch that. Finally, we just want to thank you so much for being here with us tonight. As you know, small businesses and especially bookstores are getting hit really, really hard in these uncertain times. But Politics and Prose is dedicated to still bringing you the first-class content that we're known for. So we're just really thankful to all of you, new customers, old loyal customers. You're keeping both our business and our spirits afloat. So truly, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to bring Michael Signer, author of Cry Havoc, Charlottesville and American Democracy Under Siege, onto your screens.
Well, thank you. I'm going to set my timer here so we know how long I'm going. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for showing up. It looks like there's 125 people on, which is really exciting. And I wanted to thank Politics and Prose, first of all, for what they do for the country in terms of books, and also for being so flexible and creative as to set this up. I mean, we were supposed to have a book event there last night, and as a lot of you know, and they pivoted very quickly, and it's really important to support small businesses now, like Politics and Prose, especially in these vulnerable areas like books, where the margins are so low. So I hope that you all, if you don't buy this book, I hope you buy other books. I hope you really do go out of your way to support them, because it's a very fragile time that we're heading into right now, and we're all going to need to support the economy and each other, and they're just a wonderful outfit. I also, before I get started, I wanted to say that a portion of any royalties from this book, I don't know if there will be any, will be dedicated and donated to the Heather Heyer Foundation and the Charlottesville Community Area Foundation's HEAL Fund, which was set up to help survivors and those victimized by the attacks in Charlottesville in 2017. So thank you all for joining us. This is new for me too. If you hear any loud thudding noises, I'm in my home office, and I have 2 5-year-old boys who have been here with me all day, and my wife is upstairs with them right now. This is their bedtime, so they are sworn. They know that this is a very important event for Daddy, and they are sworn to be quiet as mice. But if they're not, that is what's happening in the floor that is the ceiling above me, which is their bedroom. So let me get into this book. The first biggest question is why write this book? These were the events of Charlottesville in 2017 were very traumatic and violent and unpleasant. It's a difficult thing to even look at. And the question is why write a book? I was the mayor of the city from 2016 to 2018, served on city council for 2 years afterward, and I'm now in private life. The big picture for me is that Charlottesville, it's clear, is gonna, as the years go on, be an event in modern American history that will be remembered and studied, and that will acquire layers of meaning over time as a touchstone and a classic moment in this period of American history. And as the time is going on, it's even more in that light. And things like Hurricane Katrina or Selma or Kent State or the Chicago Convention in 1968, these are all challenging moments that came to mean different things over time. So here, I can list 4 meanings that are distinct that Charlottesville already has acquired. One is President Trump's response to it, to this outpouring of neo-Nazis and racists chanting "Jews will not replace us," openly brandishing racist slogans in the streets of a progressive college town, and saying, as complicated as his response was, there was that phrase, which was, there were very fine people on both sides, and he doubled down on it. And what that illuminated about this presidency and the nature of extremism in America was a signal moment of this. There was the mistakes of government that the very famous Vice News documentary revealed, where police from the state and the city were kind of standing by while people were assaulting and battering each other in the streets. That was another meaning, and it was shocking to people. Spike Lee did a movie, Black Klansman, where he featured a lot of the footage of these white supremacists in connection to this movie that was about the Ku Klux Klan in decades past, saying that that there's a straight line through white supremacy and the nature of American life. That was a very prominent Oscar-nominated movie. And then finally, Joe Biden, former vice president, announced that he decided to run for president because of Trump's response to Charlottesville. It's played a key role in his campaign. His first campaign video started with the word Charlottesville. And so all of a sudden, it has featured directly in presidential politics. And now that Biden is the likely nominee, it will likely feature in how and why he explains he's running for president. So the question, the real reason that I wrote this book, I'll get into this more, was to talk about what we can learn from Charlottesville. There were a tremendous amount of events that led up to, before, during, and after the actual event of August 2017. But for me, the most important work of a book about it was to learn from it, the lessons from Charlottesville. And I, as the person who happened to be the mayor during all this, I had a somewhat unusual blend of perspectives I brought to my experience of the events during the time, in the moment, and then also to studying and thinking and narrating them afterward. So I am an attorney, but I also have a doctorate in political science with a focus on political theory. So I viewed a lot of the events through that lens as well. And I have been sort of a sometime historian. I wrote a book about James Madison called Becoming Madison, where I was deep into colonial history and the shaping of our constitutional government. And so the lenses that I had as these events happened were inflected by those different experiences and fields of study. And I thought there really is, as I started writing the book, there's a treasure trove of insight and lessons from those different fields that I wanted to share. But the book is very admittedly subjective. It's a 400-page book, and as I started writing it in a month, it goes month by month through the years before, during, and after these events. I'm very direct in the beginning of the book that because it's a subjective account, there are passages and issues where I wanted to spend more time on, but there are necessarily ones where I couldn't spend as much time on. So it is my account. People ask me a lot what the experience was like, and I have a series of adjectives. It was searing to see the hatred today that has been unleashed in this environment. These were previously forces that were just in the shadows of American life. I grew up in Arlington, Virginia, 5 blocks from the modern headquarters of the modern Nazi Party, and it was like one pathetic guy who was in a rented office in what's now a coffee shop in an old house, and we always kind of took note of it, but it really said more about the dilapidated state of that kind of sophisticated fascistic hatred in America. And what was so searing about what happened in Charlottesville was seeing this emboldened, organized, violent hatred right there in public with this moniker, Unite the Right, over it. So searing. It was confusing. More often than I could believe, and the book goes into this in very kind of granular detail. There were just no clear answers to what we were supposed to do. I go through a series of demands that were placed on government at the very beginning on a lot of the issues, like the First Amendment. Just stop hate speech. Why would you allow hate speech? Well, hate speech is mandated to be allowed if it doesn't contain planned, imminent, violent, unlawful action or unlawful action by the Supreme Court. A lot of the answers were just not as clear as you would want them to be in the murk of the real day-to-day struggle that we were engaged in. The design of government was very confusing, and we have a city manager form of government in Charlottesville, which almost 50% of American cities have, where the mayor and the members of city council are not operational. They don't have a role in directing the activities of government like policing or permitting or the communications of government. You're the members of the board of directors of the city, and the city manager is the day-to-day CEO. That was designed about 100 years ago in the progressive era. Half of American cities have that form of government, but it's very confusing to people even in the government, but definitely the public during a time of crisis, because they want the people who they see on TV to be the ones who can give answers or make decisions, and that's just not how the government is set up. So it was confusing. It was frightening. Just seeing the violence and the mayhem and the way in which these events built on one another, there was a lot of fear with it. And not just for me, but for many people in the community. And when you're an elected official, you're kind of absorbing and reflecting and trying to calm a lot of the fear. But there was just fear leading to terror and intimidation all the way through many of these events. It was enraging for me, as somebody who cares a lot about governance and has been in and out of government and politics, campaigns in every different capacity, from working in the House of Delegates when I was 22, to running campaigns, to working for the governor of Virginia, to working in local office or running for office. I really care about government, and it was infuriating and enraging to see people who felt so comfortable frustrating and intimidating government. Now, there was another level, which is I'm a Jewish public official, and the level of anti-Semitism that was directed at me when I started challenging Donald Trump and these extremists was astonishing. I read about it happening to other people, like Jewish journalists and other elected officials, but to start to experience it was stunning. And to me, it was infuriating because I wanted to battle back against it as much as I could and withstand and resist it and call it out, because you shouldn't have this kind of bigotry and hatred happen in regular society. And it was infuriating. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. One time I got a cartoon in my email inbox that was a cartoon of Robert E. Lee pressing the green button on a gas chamber where my face had been photoshopped into it with a cartoon of the, Star of David on my lapel. Things like this were infuriating. And it was frustrating. There was a lot of feelings of frustration and failure when things that I would try to do, especially within this kind of government we had, would kind of slip through my fingers, or we'd find ourselves with our hands tied, or your best laid plans would somehow spin out of control. So a good example of one of the mistakes or missteps was when the Ku Klux Klan was coming to the city. I led a campaign to say, don't take the bait with every elected official and every leader, from the university to the police to the other city councilors. Because the idea was, if you tried to dissuade people and gave them an alternative to going and protesting and confronting with the Ku Klux Klan, 36 people from North Carolina were coming to the city to try and grab a spotlight and try and do something sensational in this city that already had the spotlight on it. But that very well-intended message ended up being perceived by some folks who wanted to bear witness to hatred and bear witness to bigotry, and it felt like it was kind of shutting the door on them as well. And that was, I don't know if there was any silver bullet in this, but it was certainly frustrating to not be able to craft a silver bullet that would have kind of accomplished every end and made everybody feel good. But the final word is hopeful. And this is, in a very odd way, I still remained hopeful at the end of the whole story about not just the experience that I had in this office, but about what this kind of stress test that Charlottesville represented for the whole country is kind of a microcosm of a nation kind of staggering under this today's extremism, what it said about where we can go. And I go in the beginning back to Greek tragedy and this idea of agony, and the root of the word agony is agon. And there was this idea in Greek tragedies, which is that this struggle and this conflict that's under agony, and it's under the agon, is necessary to progress. And there are Greek tragedies where conflict became kind of the raw material of moving upward and through and understanding what it took to prevail through this conflict to achieve something better. And that is one way of understanding American history, was these agonistic stress tests, overcoming Jim Crow or overcoming McCarthyism, have become necessary to us achieving higher planes of democracy's potential. And there's this idea deep within the book, and where the book ends up, about democratic resilience, which is something that I've been working on for 20 years. My dissertation was about democracy's battle with demagogues, and how you overcome demagogues is through democratic resilience. It's through people taking it upon themselves to deny a demagogue the ability to manipulate and exploit their prejudices. So I believe in democratic resilience. I think it's kind of the secret to how America has gotten this far so fast. And I have a hope, with a lot of evidence, I think, that Charlottesville, as difficult as it was, ends up being a stress test that leads to greater democratic resilience in American democracy. And that's the kind of biggest thesis of the book. Let me go on and tell you just a little bit about my background. And again, this is challenging because I'm trying to borrow from the outline that I was going to use with all of you in front of me. And I've been to Politics and Prose a million times, and I hope you're following this. I hope that this outline works. I hope to hear from you afterward if it doesn't, because I'll be trying to do more of these. I talk in the book about my grandfather, Herb Signer, who was a lifelong proofreader. He worked at the New York Times. He didn't graduate from college, in part because he took part in a protest against fascism. He later became a member of the American Communist Party, and then he delisted along with my grandmother when Khrushchev disclosed Stalin's war crimes in the mid-50s. So, and I didn't know anything about his political activity until decades later. He told me right after I got out of college. And he told me this very haunting thing, which was that everything becomes its opposite. And he told me a couple of specifics. He was fascinated by how public housing towers had seemed like such a good idea at the time, and they became their opposite. And he was also interested in how communism, which was so idealistic and utopian, had become its opposite. And that really stuck in my mind. This was right after college, and it became the seed of kind of a fascination that ended up shaping a lot of not only what I studied, but what I decided to do as an activist or an elected official, which was try and work on this side of democracy that can so easily flip into its opposite, but can also become such a hopeful, extraordinary producer of progress and potential. But that the fact that democracy can become tyranny so easily through history is what has fascinated me. So lo and behold, here I am. The book starts with coming into this position of local office in Charlottesville. I turned 40, and we had a very cosmopolitan life in the DC area. We're living in Arlington, right near where I'd grown up. My wife and I were in a 550 square foot, 1-bedroom condo near courthouse, and I was practicing law and doing all kinds of other things. And I basically had a turning 40 moment where I just didn't want to have a life that was dominated by so many Washington type concerns and being close to powerful institutions. And I wanted a life, and my wife was generous enough to go with me down this path that would be based in a small community. And I had gone to law school at UVA and had really fallen very deeply in love with that particular city, having traveled all around the country, and had a lot of friends there, in a house that was right near downtown Charlottesville in a majority neighborhood that I loved called Fifeville, and moved back there with her after we got married, and kind of started a very local block by block life, and was practicing law above a brewery, and became head of the neighborhood association, and got the Citizens Police Academy, and got very involved in local politics. And then there was an opening on the city council, and some people asked me to run for it. It's a part-time position in Charlottesville, and I had done a lot of I'd been on staff on a presidential campaign. I'd run for lieutenant governor of Virginia. This was a very different experience, and I decided that it was worth going all in to local elected office. And the mayor in Charlottesville and in many Virginia cities is chosen from within the council. It's just a vote on council. So I ended up becoming mayor the very first meeting that I was on city council. And I go through this in the book. And what I want to explain in the book is setting the context for these events that got very famous during August 2017. There was a whole history that I saw of a backdrop of conflict and a very charged, unreconciled tensions that led the way to the Unite the Right rally. There were two other white nationalist events earlier that same year. There was Richard Spencer, who was a UVA graduate, who founded the term alt-right, came in May with 100 followers with tiki torches to the base of the Robert E. Lee statue. And then, which was the vote to remove it, was one of the issues that led to so much controversy that was connected with all this. And then the KKK came in July, and then there was the march down the UVA grounds on Friday, August 12th, and then the rally on August 11th, the rally on August 12th, Unite the Right rally. So there was a whole history that year. Another one of the things I wanted to do with the book was I've taught classes several times at UVA and elsewhere on leadership and democracy, leadership and statesmanship. And I'm pretty well acquainted with the political science and public administration leadership literature. And I'm frustrated by it, a lot of it. And I'm also very frustrated by memoirs and biographies that don't tell the truth and don't tell how messy actual leadership and democracy is. And I wanted to do the opposite in this book. There was a friend of mine I was telling about all the events in the book, and he said, this was wrestling in the gray. And I love that phrase, and I talk about it in the book. This is meant to be a book that is about the gray, messy, frustrating areas of day-to-day actual leadership challenges and actual city governance and actual municipal decisions, particularly in a crisis. And my view is that even if that's frustrating to write and read in some ways, and that it doesn't reflect the kind of Hollywood sanitized or clean narrative like we want a lot of the time, it's more beneficial because the messiness of true storytelling and actually capturing the complexity is bound to be more useful to other people seeking to understand what really happened. And I've had in my mind, I talk in the book about this classic of literature about mayors called A Prayer for the City that Buzz Bissinger wrote, the journalist, about Ed Rendell's tenure as mayor of Philadelphia, which is very messy and very real and wonderful to read. And mayors talk about it a lot. If you look at the presidential autobiographies, people talk about Ulysses Grant's memoirs because they were so true and honest and real in his failings and the challenges of the situation. And that's how I'm trying to set up this book, is to be useful in that same way. So the book is designed, just a couple more notes on the book. It is not a memoir. We were very clear, my editor and I, working from the beginning, this is a first person account. And I ended up cutting out through the umpteen drafts of the book all these very personal details. The book began with a letter to my sons about what this event might mean and what they might learn and think about me years hence. And ultimately I had to cut out, there's this saying of killing your darlings as you're editing a book. And I had to kill a lot of those types of things because they ended up being just too much about me and not about Charlottesville as microcosm for this country under siege and these larger messages about how democracy can prevail and city as a microcosm. And so having even the title, which my editor came up with, ended up being a very helpful guidepost through the drafts of this book, because it really is about American democracy under siege. And that helped clarify a lot of it. With that said, it was really rewarding having the opportunity to write a story about this small town, because the characters and the plot twists of this extraordinary story were so incredibly interesting. And as you get into it, there are these larger than life characters, which to anybody who follows politics in a small town will seem familiar, although very distinct. And I, tell people a lot, I would say this when I was mayor, if anybody's watched Parks and Rec, I would say it's not a satire. I mean, this is the experience of a lot of mayors and local elected officials or chairs of boards, is that you have very larger than life figures who steer a lot of events down their path and have a lot of impact in a fairly small city. And so the book tracks and focuses on a lot of those types of characters. The structure of the book is that I talk about the difficulty of finding a metaphor that would capture what happened in Charlottesville. And I landed on this metaphor of a firestorm and talk about these underlying brush fires that stemmed from these points of friction in Charlottesville's experience that kind of burst into flame and converged together. The first one was the conflict about how to provide for order and civility or respect in a time of very intense passions and a frustration with these kinds of guideposts. The second was what to do about race and memory in public spaces in a time when Confederate statues, but many other things like this, are coming under question and attack. The third was the First Amendment, how to reconcile public safety and freedom of speech, which bedeviled us. The fourth, after the crisis, was how to provide accountability and truth-telling about mistakes and things that went wrong, to the public crying out for answers. And then the final one is equity. There's a lot of drive for equity now, but equity can also, it can track it can take down things as well as build them up. And I wanted to tell a true story about that as well in the city's experience. And there is a real focus in the last part of the book on keeping on with this metaphor of a firestorm, on the aftermath and the afterburn. And if anybody's familiar with slash and burn agriculture, it's a kind of agriculture where the ashes from a fire end up providing fertilizer for growth, basically for new growth. And I talk about that. And that is my belief, is that the aftermath of all this can generate learning and wisdom. And I talk about reading Proverbs late into the night and this quest for wisdom, which is the theme of that book in the Bible. And there are many specifics. I want to talk just about a couple of specifics on the learning before I'm going to read 4 pages from the book and then get to questions. But let me just, there were 2 other things I wanted to mention. It was very important for me to include in this narrative mistakes that I made. I thought, first of all, it's more true, it's more interesting for any other leader or anybody working with leaders. I think it's relevant to find, as an honest account of mistakes that were made and learning that came after them. And I'll go through, there are more, but I'll go through 4 with you. One was kind of getting sometimes wrapped up in the pomp and circumstance of being mayor, but not explaining to the people, the city manager form of government, where I actually had so much less power than the honorific role of mayor made it seem like. I talk about that. I told the story about Unity Seville. There was this key moment where it was really challenging to figure out how to support the police while also support the people when the police had made a mistake where there was tear gas released after the KKK came. And I even go very specifically go into the text back and forth with the city manager, who was, as I kind of whipsawed between supporting the city government and then dealing with the fact that mistakes likely were made and redrafting Facebook posts and trying to get in the right place on this. There really was no right place, but I think it's important to tell those kinds of stories. And then a final story is, this is really a doozy, was after the Unite the Right rally, there was the tourism took an incredible blow in the city, and there was a lot of agony about how do we kind of boost the city's image. And there was a love sign, a big 6-7 foot tall letters on the downtown mall that spelled out love, because our slogan is Virginia is for lovers. And I was asked by the city communication staff to go and take a picture in front of the love sign. And instead of just taking a picture, I chose to jump and do a tweet that said, Charlottesville's back on our feet and ready for business, or something like that. And it was just completely the wrong thing to do for this emotionally traumatized, physically traumatized many people in the public. It seemed like I wasn't connected to the emotional mood of the city. And it was an instance where I would counsel other people in the same position trying to cheerlead for the city. I don't know what there's a better answer than that. And I certainly had to think about it and live with some chagrin about it. But I do think there are lessons in trying to figure out how to cheerlead better for a city while still paying attention to the emotional climate in a crisis. Just want to tell a final thing, and then I'll get to the reading. So the argument of the book is that this kind of trauma and agony can still prove useful as a stress test. And I go into many specifics in the end about ways that Charlottesville and all of what happened there have been useful as prods to American institutions figuring out the next chapter. First Amendment is really relevant on this. Much of the drama in the book is the ways in which the First Amendment, the absolute tests of prevailing kind of First Amendment dogma, didn't serve us in the city in trying to reconcile public safety with freedom of speech. Because for instance, there's what's called a credible threat test, where any statement by anybody is filtered through this extremely narrow lens of, does it contain an explicit statement of planned, imminent, unlawful action? That ends up being too fine-grained of a filter for looking at the context in which these statements are maybe signaling a conflict to come. The government does have a duty to stop. But then there's this test called the heckler's veto, where government is not supposed to give any power to somebody who might heckle an event that they're offended by, thereby causing it to be unsafe, thereby canceling the free speech. I just wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal's ideas section on Saturday, an essay talking about the failings of this free speech dogma, and saying there is a tradition in constitutional decisions by the Supreme Court, often in dissent, where they would look more pragmatically toward the judgments of on-the-ground officials while still protecting free speech. But for instance, a notable fact about Charlottesville was the University of Virginia hospital canceled all elective surgeries in the week before the Unite the Right rally, because looking at the facts, they were just so worried about likely conflict between protesters and counter-protesters. That is the sort of piece of evidence that courts ought to be able to take into account, rather than just these black and white fixed tests. And I think that when Governor Northam just banned firearms from the Capitol grounds with this massive Second Amendment rally recently, and he was upheld in doing that by the Virginia Supreme Court. And I think that is a sign of growth and evolution that's happening organically as a result of American institutions looking at the stress test of Charlottesville. So these are some of the reasons that I have a somewhat a sort of steely optimism about where the American Republic goes from this awful set of circumstances. I think you could look at the federal government is going to have to get its act together on infiltrating and monitoring and disrupting violent white nationalism, even though the Trump administration, that was the last thing they wanted to do for the first couple of years. They're going to have to, because of what Charlottesville revealed. There's a lot of learning about reconciliation and healing and reaching out to marginalized groups or potentially radicalized ones as a result of Charlottesville, and the list goes on of consequences. So with all that said, I'm gonna read the very final 4 pages of the book and then get into any questions. So this will be now it'll feel like I'm back and doing a book reading again. Okay. And I'm going to put on my readers. All right. Take a drink of water. This is the conclusion. When the histories are written, they will show that this era featured an extraordinary flaring up of political furies. The gray area dwindled, black and white took over. Passions reigned in the highest and lowest halls of government. I've tried to give the facts here as best as I could, but nobody will ever finally define what Charlottesville means, because the stakes of another interpretation are simply too high. The question becomes instead, what can we make of it? As I finished writing this book, Charlottesville remained a raw mass of contradictions, a microcosm for a nation wrestling to shake free from an angry and violent era. Spike Lee's Oscar-nominated Black Klansman featured searing footage from Charlottesville in the last few minutes of the film, virtually soldering a connection between the story of a black man infiltrating the KKK in the 1970s and the violence of white nationalists in Charlottesville. During the fateful year of 2017, I was often told that Charlottesville had become a hashtag. Charlottesville was now hashtag Charlottesville. But what did that actually mean? Just as in the battle to frame Charlottesville, there is not one definitive answer. There are instead facets to the massive morphing cultural phenomenon, the signifier that is hashtag Charlottesville. On the one hand, it was the most vivid expose of the far right in our times, punctuated by violence and terrorism and a broader story of the rise of white nationalism in America and the world. As instances of right-wing violence became more common, a horrific massacre took place at a mosque in New Zealand in March 2019, for example. Charlottesville seemed to become more and more of a meme. As domestic terrorism and white nationalism go, Charlottesville's meaning is alarming. And then here I go into some of the statistics about increased white nationalism. But hashtag Charlottesville also represented one of the bloodiest self-inflicted wounds of the Trump administration, the point when Steve Bannon was forced out of the White House, and a scandal that had every appearance of being Trump's Hurricane Katrina until now. It had also represented in Virginia a quickening to the long, slow death of the nexus of states' rights, massive resistance, and Dixiecrats that had poisoned Virginia politics in the modern era. So too does hashtag Charlottesville encompass contagious efforts to repudiate the alt-right celebration of Confederate icons by removing them. Indeed, in January 2019, my alma mater, Washington Lee High School in Arlington, Virginia, renamed itself Washington Liberty High School in order to remove Robert E. Lee's name. And hashtag Charlottesville holds the failures of policing, but it also contains teachable moments for police forces, prosecutors, mayors, and judges around the country. The multifaceted meaning of hashtag Charlottesville reinforces the unique power the alchemy even of American constitutionalism. Dayton, Ohio employed the successful anti-militia litigation technique from our lawsuit with Georgetown's Institute of Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. And my conversation partner tonight was supposed to be Mary McCord, who is a former national security prosecutor under President Obama, who works at a center at Georgetown, which I mentioned, which we worked with in the city to sue over 10 of these right-wing militias that invaded the city on using a provision in Virginia's constitution that was 200 years old that basically makes organized paramilitary groups illegal. And it led to success. It led to binding consent decrees where they came to court, they agreed not to come back to the city, and it kept the city safe at the 1-year anniversary of the Unite the Right rally. So it was an innovation within our democratic institutions as a result of Charlottesville. So Dayton employed that same technique successfully to lead also to a KKK group from bringing assault rifles in the city. A new landscape is emerging from the madness and mayhem of Charlottesville as surely as wisdom is produced by trauma in ancient Greek tragedy. And I go into a couple of examples of private sector companies who have also taken it upon themselves to try and deplatform violent white nationalists from their companies because of what happened in Charlottesville. As I review this journey, I remain haunted by the great paradox of history my grandfather described for me so many years ago. Everything becomes its opposite, he had said. It took me 20 years and the experiences described in this book to understand that his paradox is actually a challenge. If we can, we must stop democracy too from becoming its opposite. The central challenge of democracy has always been resisting the lowest common denominator and instead supporting our norms and our institutions to enable democracy to provide solutions to problems rather than just magnifying them. Our politics and our governments should challenge us and educate us precisely when we want to be most impassioned, especially when things are complicated. But if this story proves anything, it's that this approach doesn't cater to today's public opinion. It doesn't offer people the instant reassurance they seek nowadays as we are sucked into the maelstrom of extreme positions churning against one another. In the face of so many hurtling into the fray, such leadership can be attacked as inert, unresponsive, even cowardly, but we must still dare to do it. Creating space for thought, challenging black and white absolutist opinions, forcing leaders to consider substance rather than symbols, educating rather than flattering the public, choosing to wrestle in the gray. These can not only be unpopular, they can be politically hazardous. They can feel like attacks not only on a system, but on people's very emotions, on their desire to fall deeply in love with one side or another, with one symbol or another. But this is all the more reason to think things through, to design our politics around the richness of the actual problems and the solutions they actually require. I go into some issues that require that approach, whether extremism or domestic terrorism, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, climate change or infrastructure. The answers and the politics of getting them must be at once forceful and thoughtful. That doesn't mean bureaucratic or sclerotic, risk-averse, pencil-necked, or four-eyed. It does mean we can be at once conscientious and principled and nuanced and pragmatic. James Madison's political victories over 2 centuries ago proved that our democracy can deliberate rather than dumb things down. They suggest that even after this valley of death, even after the blood and chaos of Charlottesville, there's sunlight ahead. In a time when Sinclair Lewis' It Can't Happen Here became a bestseller 80 years after it was first published in 1935, in a time of rising populist authoritarians, not only in the United States, but around the world, deliberative democracy can still prevail. The victories to achieve it will be violent. They will come at great cost. Leaders will be battered and the arc will be jagged, but the trajectory will be upward. I was once at a funeral pyre at the burning Ghats in Varanasi, India. In the early morning, along the banks of the murky Ganges River, I watched as a blackened corpse burned, surrounded by loving family members who murmured and chanted. I was told how the tradition is to query the patterns in the smoke for signs of destiny. In the wisps of smoke that twist up above the ash and agony of Charlottesville, there's hope for a burned, torn, scarred, but still indomitable country. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to go to some audience questions. And I want to read them in the order that they were upvoted, but the first one I want to read is from someone you may know named Mira Signer. And she says, "I'm so proud of you. I can't stay on because we were having an Uber meltdown," which I think we can all relate to. But her question is, what was the hardest part of the book to write?
Oh my God. Of course, that question is going to come from my sister. I think the hardest part was, oh man, I think the hardest part was writing about my mistakes. I talk in the book about how I talk about going to therapy and how this was a key turning point. And I want to be clear. I mean, we just had a book event last week in Richmond where there were 15 members of the activist community who had very different means than I did for defending Charlottesville and fighting for Charlottesville, and are very traumatized and had felt like they hadn't had a moment to have me personally hear their point of view. And I thought it was an incredibly valuable conversation. It was very raw. And my experiences and personal trauma pale in comparison to somebody who was actually, on the site with the car when it came through, or who, was physically assaulted or emotionally vulnerable and traumatized. And I don't think there's a comparison. I do think that it's valuable to hear about leaders' experiences in a microcosm like this, because lots of other leaders are going to have to deal with things like this. And I thought it was important to go into the whole story of just coming to the point of talking about mistakes. And it was very difficult to write. I actually had this whole list of like 10, and then my editor said, it's too much. It comes across. It's just, he said it's enough to talk about 3 or 4 in this one part in the book. And it was really challenging to come to the right kind of emotional place and to figure out the right words and specifics. But, and it was in and of itself a journey, but I thought it was really important.
The next question actually has the most votes, and I'm going to combine it with one. So first, what can we do as citizens to combat the rise of extremism in our communities? And I'm going to combine that with Bo's question, which is, what solutions can you offer for us to reach out to marginalized groups? So I think kind of as a two-parter, solutions for what we can do as citizens and how we can reach out to marginalized communities.
It's such a great question. So I spent the last year and a half before the book came out in a project that I started with a number of other groups called Communities Overcoming Extremism, the After Charlottesville project. So it was with the Anti-Defamation League, the Ford Foundation, the Charles Koch Institute. So it was a bipartisan effort, New America in DC. And our goal was to study and share insights and case studies, and in some cases breakthroughs for community work against extremism. And if you want to look at the final report that was produced, it's at www.overcomingextremism. One of the lessons that came out of it was, this is kind of the biggest picture global frame that came out of it, was we need democratic resilience is the immune system for democracy to fight against these. I mean, it's so ironic that we're talking about viruses now, because an immune system has always been a great metaphor for this body politic. And we have an immune system against forces of tyranny and bigotry and extremism. It has been our norms and institutions and the people themselves, and it needs to be as proactive and robust as possible. And in the project, we found that it's useful to talk about community work against extremism before, during, and after events as having a hard and a soft side. Hard side means strengthening and making more robust every tool you have to be more aggressive in cracking down on violent extremism. So that means federal authorities that are accurately researching and infiltrating and disrupting and monitoring these groups that can become terrorist groups. It also means prosecuting them more aggressively, and it means our intelligence needs to be better. A lot of the planning that was most explicit for this event happened on Discord, which is a private, password-protected gaming platform. So there's a lot of more aggressive programs that have to happen through companies. They're called trust and safety programs. And we worked with a bunch of these companies like Patreon or Pinterest, Airbnb, PayPal that have adopted very aggressive trust and safety programs internally because of the need to strengthen this immune system. But then there's the soft side. There's the hard side and the soft side. The soft side has to do with civil society organizations, so nonprofits, faith institutions, police, community service officers and police forces, schools, doing everything they can, again, to be proactive in reaching out to groups who are marginalized, who could be radicalized or victimized. And that, so in Chattanooga, for instance, I talk about one case study, the mayor in Chattanooga has set up a council against hate. They have a program there where every new recruit who comes, or new officer who comes into the police, has to spend time with a marginalized group and write a paper from the perspective of the marginalized group. So you're really building into the routines of just the basic agencies of government, an understanding of the spectrum of society, because Chattanooga is an old South town that has a lot of new population, that has had a terrorist attack in 2015 and has had over 100 bias incidents, and needs this kind of proactivity. The final thing is organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, big, forceful, sophisticated anti-bigotry nonprofits that really do work in communities and work with leadership groups like, prosecuting hate crimes and police chiefs, and have getting out education into the schools. Those are groups that are really worth supporting and finding them.
Okay, next question. This is from Beth. I'm from a small town in Kansas where a lot of people say politics don't have a place in local government and to let the state and federal governments handle political matters. When did you know you had to step in as head of your local government?
That's a great question too. And I thought one of the reasons it was important telling this very messy story, going back earlier than just the year of the events, was there were a lot of demands that were being placed on local government. And I took a very proactive stance as mayor, because the prior mayor was a wonderful guy. He had been there for 2 terms, but he wasn't that proactive in the community. And I kind of decided that I wanted to be very proactive. And that came with a lot of risks, because in many more cities than was normal in Charlottesville, the city councilors do take a backseat to the city manager and to the state and federal government. And Charlottesville is a very progressive community. It's kind of a flashpoint for many issues that are coming up. That's one of the reasons that it became a microcosm, because there was work about these statues, but many other issues like that. And I wanted to paint this picture because when you take on a lot of political challenges, like I was, writing articles about why Donald Trump should be stopped in the Electoral College, because that was, I had expertise in that area, and I'd been very public in calling him out as a textbook demagogue, and thought demagogues are very alarming for the city, and for the system, and that's what the Constitution talks very much about them. That's what the Electoral College was designed to stop. So I became very political in a lot of ways, and there were great costs to that. So I don't think there's really one lesson or another. Or one direction or another. There's just, you have to understand that you open up a whole range of demands and questions the more political missions you take on in local government, particularly in the city manager form of government, where elected officials are really the managing board of the city. It's not to say that you don't do those actions. It's to say that you should think fully through the kind of library of questions and challenges that are going to come along with being more politically proactive.
Okay, next we have 3 years on. Do you think this could happen again in Charlottesville or elsewhere in the country? Or do you think we have already learned and applied lessons?
Oh, I absolutely think it could happen elsewhere in the country. I mean, you had last year, you had very significant clashes in Portland between the violent white nationalists and counter-protesters and anti-fascists that were, I mean, the poor mayor there, he has tried so hard. And one of the ironies of the book is a lot of Charlottesville seemed very unique. And it was unique, but then it also had incredible similarities to a lot the experience in cities like Berkeley and Portland, which also had these sorts of clashes during that same year and even afterward. So I'm worried about clashes like that, and they can spring up for one reason or another. I'm worried about actual political violence. I've been a member of a couple of different groups that have been trying to think through the likelihood of political violence happening. I mean, we've already seen it. We've seen, assassination attempts by the guy in Florida, and we've seen the horrible rampages of the Tree of Life ceremony and in El Paso. I mean, these are directly connected to extremism in our political life and conspiracy theories online. So I wake up every week with I don't think I'll ever not be concerned that this threat has gone away. I think that we have to strengthen, as I've said, all the hard and soft tools that we have against it. Charlottesville is still there's a lot of trauma in the city, and it's a very raw mood. I mean, there was a lot of angst around what was seen as the over militarization of the police at the 1-year anniversary of the events. Kind of in response to trying to establish a whole new security plan that would establish fixed areas where you could have entry and exit, which didn't happen before, and that kind of caused a lot of angst. But you didn't have any white nationalists come back the 1-year anniversary. I think there is concern about other things that could happen to draw them back. But that's one of the reasons I think having the militia lawsuit and the consent decrees from it was such an important step to take, because those organized militias can't come back to the city. I think anybody who says, well, they just shot themselves in the foot, it's over, is fooling themselves, because it is like a virus, the white nationalist extremism, and it will be there. And I think it needs to be this sense of vigilance from government and from against it. But no, I don't think anybody should be declaring victory.
So my final question of the night is, since, as you said, you are self-isolating with your wife and your 2 kids, what are you reading?
Oh, what a good question. I have Ron Chernow's book about Ulysses Grant that's with me. I have this. I have an incredible book about World War II. The name is escaping me, but it's a novel told from the perspective of everyday Germans who were forming a resistance, and their neighbors who were becoming SS officers. It's a little bit of a dark read, but it's pretty absorbing. Those are my 2 very active reads. I should look around my office right now, because I always have a hard time with that story, and then it's like there are 10 others. But if anybody emails me, I'll put it up on Twitter or something, because I have about 10 that are ongoing right now on my nightstand.
Nice. Well, if you all want to order Michael Signer's book, you can press the button right down here. It is the big green button. Order it straight from Politics and Prose. I got word we've already got some orders rolling in, so that's amazing. Michael, I want to thank you so much for being our very first inaugural digital event.
It was a huge honor to be your guinea pig. I love the store. I hope everybody buy just some books from Politics and Prose. I hope that you follow this. I'm going to. Brittany, you've been great. And I want to emphasize a portion of any royalties. I don't know if there will be any, but we'll go to the Heather Heyer Foundation and the Heal Charlottesville Fund. And you should support those organizations, even if you don't buy this book, because they do unbelievable, really important work in a area that's still in a city that's still working on healing. And I just really appreciate this opportunity a huge amount. And email me at msigner.author@gmail.com with any suggestions, questions, invitations, whatever. I'm got lots more time now on my hands.
And I want to thank all of you for tuning into our first ever digital event. We are planning many more of these with Politics in Prose. In fact, we have 2 already scheduled for this week. Tomorrow at 7 p.m., March 18th, it will be Jesse Ujewska Stevens in conversation with Emily Mitchell discussing the exhibition of Persephone Q. And then on March 19th, also at 7, Jesse Wegman will be with Adam Liptak for his book, Let the People Pick the President, The Case for Abolishing the Electoral College.
And that's a great book. That's a great book. I know Jesse. He's awesome. That's an important book. It's an amazing lineup.
Awesome. That's a good recommendation there. Thank you all for joining us. Truly, right now in these crazy, crazy times, this is what's keeping us going. We had 165 people tuning in today. That is incredible. It makes us so happy. So please continue supporting both our authors and Politics in Prose by ordering online. You get free shipping all through March. Please tune in. You can click the follow button on Crowdcast. If you look, it's near our logo there, and you can follow and you'll get notifications for all of the events that we have going on this platform. You can always order the books, and yeah, we're just really excited to be able to do this. We hope all of you are staying safe.
And this video will be available for future watching.
Yes,
so
we're recording it.
You can also share it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You can share it. There's also, you can share it right now with friends. I know if you're on mobile, but we will absolutely have it, and we'll put it up and you can share it. So thanks everyone. Stay well read, stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
Thank you.